Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today I want to show you this. This is one of the favorite swords in my collection, but it's also one of my favorite styles of sword overall. So I'm actually quite excited to show it to you, and please forgive me if I kind of lose track of what I'm saying, because there's a lot of stuff about this sword that I like and I want to share. But I'll try to keep it clear and to the point. This is what is often referred to as a Walloon-hilted sword. And by often referred to, I mean it's not really its official name. It was a name that was given to this kind of sword with this hilt with these asymmetrical kind of bars. And you also find it with different names. So you also find it referred to sometimes as campaign swords or other less common names. However, for many sword enthusiasts, when you say Walloon-hilted sword, you know kind of what you're referring to. Most of the ones you see in museums or at auctions are rather hefty weapons. They have very broad blades, rather long too, and very big and heavy hilts. They're rather imposing swords that you can imagine being used in a big battlefield or in some of those big conflicts, let's say between the mid 17th century, perhaps in the mid 18th century. However, this, while it has many of the common characteristics of the Walloon-hilted sword, is really not exactly that. It's more of a scaled down version. It's more light, more nimble. The blade actually has quite a bit of flex to it. I won't overdo it though, because I don't want to ruin this one. But it's a very light sword, almost more similar to what you would think of when you think of a spadroon, for example. And perhaps the fact that its feel is so similar to a spadroon is not by chance. There is a rather frequently shared image on a lot of communities of sword enthusiasts, which was an image created by Nick Thomas of the Academy of Historical Fencing, in which you kind of can see the evolution of the spadroon. And swords just like these, so scaled down Walloon-hilted swords in different configurations of hilts, are reported as being the early versions of the spadroon. So maybe you could see also proto-spadroon, perhaps. And he dates them between 1650 and 1770, if I'm not mistaken. So this kind of sword is indeed a spadroon, or an early ancestor of the spadroon, let's say. And actually, speaking of famous YouTube sword educators, this kind of sword is also mentioned by Matt Easton in a video, specifically the one in which he talks about swords used by pirates. He does mention at some point that among the different variations of swords they used, one potentially common one on ships would have been a scaled down. I think he mentioned the fact that they were scaled down. I'm certain he mentioned the Walloon-hilt sword. So there's definitely multiple confirmation of this kind of sword being used on ships, perhaps, and in a time frame, let's say, between the mid 17th and mid 18th century. And as we'll see, as soon as we look at the inscriptions on the blade, this sword falls precisely within both that time frame, but also that use. So while I'm fairly sure this was used on a ship, it was not necessarily used by pirates. Although, depending on your definition of pirates and your point of view on history, it might actually very well have been used by pirates, and possibly some of the worst the seas have seen. We'll look at it in just a moment. I just wanted to mention before we go into further detail that I'm quite proud of this sword and having bought it, because the sellers had misinterpreted, I guess, the inscriptions. The inscriptions actually date the sword very precisely, and they also give a very precise location and function for it, which is not too common for swords of this age. And it's luck, mostly, maybe because of the location where I am and my interest, but I kind of was able, something a little bell rang in my head, and that kind of made sense, and further research proved that I was correct. So I know I'm dropping a lot of hints here, but we're going to see it right now because I want to show you what I'm talking about. So let's dive into the details. Okay, so let's take that close-up look we've been waiting for. We'll start from the hilt and grip. So the first thing we can notice is the typical, this is what a typical Walloon hilt looks like. It has these bars that protect especially the right side of the grip here, of the sword. And they're kind of asymmetrical, and you can find different configurations of them. Some are more complex with more bars. Some lack this sidebar here, for example. Some are more symmetrical, some aren't, but you generally have this kind of configuration with one bent bar here on the inside, and then you have one or two or more, perhaps, on the outside here. You'll also notice that the hilt is very asymmetrical, so my right hand perfectly fits and is very well protected. Well, apart from stabs, I suppose, because it's rather open. But my left hand really doesn't even fit. Like, my knuckle touches the edge here and actually is not protected from by the hilt. So a asymmetrical shaped hilt. We can then see this oval pommel. This is fairly common. You'll find them in different configurations. These weren't mass-produced, or they weren't produced to standard. So you may find some that are more oblong, some more flat and compressed, some more oval. But overall, you'll generally find this kind of olive shape or oval-shaped pommel. And another characteristic which is fairly common is the fact that it has this bar, which is held in place by a screw. So if you remember the video of the Albertina sword, for example, but other similar swords exist, this is an earlier version of fixing that in place, so via a screw. This one, by the way, is actually loose, so I think it's not going to be a huge problem to take it apart. You also have this section of the hilt that fits into a hole in the pommel. So once everything's in place and the screw is tightened, this kind of fits in its place and it's held in place. But it's not like welded, or it's not a one part with the pommel. So these are the typical characteristics of these hilts. You also often see this little hook, or this little protuberance, I guess, on the hilt. The hilt is made of steel, so it's not like a brass and we also see the pretty simple quillin here. It's an extension of the knuckle guard, and on it is welded these two shells. These shells, I call them shells because, as we'll see, they're actually decorated as shells. You see these lines running. They're very finely engraved, so you can actually not really even feel, you can hardly or not even really feel a groove, but they're very visible, and they're visible in quite a few extant models of this sword. And yeah, these shells, again, asymmetrical. One is a little smaller on the inside of the hilt, and one is larger here on the outside of the hilt. These are welded onto the bar structure we have here. We then have the blade. So if we take a look at the blade, we can see it has a generally lenticular section, so that is kind of like a oval section. And it has a thin fuller that runs not far up the blade. So let me get that in focus. It runs about up to here, so about 1/5 of the blade, not much. It then becomes fully lenticular again, and the blade actually tends to flatten towards the tip here. It's a double-edged blade, and both edges were definitely sharp at some point. It's still something I wouldn't want to run my over my skin with too much enthusiasm, but it's not razor sharp today. The tip we can see here is, in this specific one, there's a slight flattening on the tip. Let me just show you, so you can see there a little bit overturned, but it's really minor, a minor defect. I'm sorry, this is for some reason tough to focus today. But it's overall in very good condition, and you see it has what is a spear tip to it. Now moving to the more interesting part, I think, of the sword, which are the elements that help us recognize it or place it in time. One thing that was, as you can see, it's all very loose, by the way. Let me show you here a second. The peened section of the blade, the section that would be peened over the end of the pommel, here is missing, and someone fixed some wooden shims in place. Now, this is actually, it's not missing any part of the blade apart from that peened section. If I push everything into place, so if I push the hilt down up to the end of the ricasso, you can actually see the edge of the blade of the tang barely protruding here. So I think it would still be possible to fix it in place without damaging the blade in the future, for example. But at the moment, it's all very loose. But if we look at the blade, as I was saying, we have some numbers on the delicate and rather shallow fuller. We have a 1, a 7, and a 1, and a 7. Now these were sold when in the seller's description, they were described as talismanic numbers. So you may be familiar with the common 1414 or 1441. These are numbers that you often find in older swords, and we don't really know what the reason for them was. We assume they were talismanic or like good luck numbers. And these were described as that, but they're not. These are a date. So this is and I can say this for two reasons. The first is that I've never seen a 1717 number being described as a talismanic number. So that is a reason for doubt that this was well, it was more a reason for me to think that this may be a date. And the other reason is that after researching this kind of sword, there are a few models I've been able to find in museums in the Netherlands, and they all have a date written in this exact position on both sides of the blade, as you can see. So this is a date, 1717. We then have these inscriptions here. You can see a Z or a Z, depending on where you live. Again, on both sides. On one side, it's a little more visible and marked. On the other, it's a little more shallow. Then a V with these extra elements that I'll explain in just a moment, and an M. So again, the description of the seller said that there was a inscription with a Z or Z, V, M. But having lived in the Netherlands, this V immediately popped, well, living still in the Netherlands actually, this V immediately popped to my eye as being the symbol of the V.O.C. or V.O.C. This was the Dutch company of the East Indies. This is a institution that deserves a whole video in and of itself. They basically literally and legally owned many of the Dutch colonies for hundreds of years until their bankruptcy. They were a private company, a company of shareholders, one of the first like modern companies where shares were bought and sold. One of the first companies to have an actual logo. This V with an O and the C on its bars here, on its sidebars, is omnipresent in representations and objects from the Netherlands from the, well, 16 to 17 to early 1800s. So it's a very interesting company and business. It's also a very sad one. They were obviously very involved in exploiting native resources and populations. Not only that, they were also very active in exploiting their own employees. Their men, their sailors were very poorly paid, and this probably contributed to the exploitation of the private exploitation of people in the Dutch colonies at the time. So a very interesting and rich history that was not necessarily recognized by the seller, who was not in the Netherlands. It was an auction house, by the way. And what's also interesting is that the Z and M are not very commonly seen. Normally you will find an A present here, or sometimes an R, for example. And this stands for the different chambers of the V.O.C. that were using the logo. So they had a common logo, but the V.O.C. was divided into 7 chambers, if I'm not mistaken, each headquartered in one of the major cities of the country. So A represents Amsterdam, R represented Rotterdam, for example, and this Z or Z and the M represents the chamber of Zeeland. This is in the southwest of the Netherlands. It's close to the border with Belgium. Zeeland, of course, it's a series of islands, and obviously was a central hub for maritime commerce and transportation at the time. The M here, which you find less often, is Middelburg. Middelburg is the capital of the province of Zeeland. And while you normally will find this configuration, so a Z with a V.O.C, in this case there's also the M. This led me to think for some time that it might be fake, because these V.O.C swords are often quite sought after and faked. Not specifically these Walloon ones, because they're not very common, even people don't really know about them, which you'll often find klevang blades or more Indonesian traditional blades with supposedly antique V.O.C markings that often are fake. So this led me into some doubt. But then if I found out that there still is a crest in the ex-V.O.C headquarter in Middelburg that has the same configuration with the M. I'll actually show you a picture in the video. So I still was in doubt for quite a long time about the authenticity of the sword, even after I bought it. I did get in touch with a museum here that actually has one of these just a little earlier, I think from 1712, in their collection. And they were kind enough to send me pictures of the sword in their collection. And while they can't, they're not allowed to provide authentication of a sword, from the pictures they sent and like the exchanges we had, it's definitely, this sword is definitely consistent with being of the age. It has all the correct elements and characteristics. So I might have it officially authenticated, but for now this is enough for me to, to be very satisfied with it and with its history. So I know I talked a lot. I hope I've said everything and I've showed you everything you wanted to see. If I've missed anything, please let me know and I'll be happy to show it to you again. As you can see, the blade is in surprisingly good condition. It has some pitting, but it's very, very light. You can still see the shine of the steel very well. It's overall a purchase I am extremely happy with. And just to conclude on these inscriptions then, as I was mentioning, this falls in line with the videos by Nick Thomas's picture and with Matt Easton's video. This is from 1717, so it fits within that time frame, and it would have been used on ships or by men who were on ships transported to these Dutch colonies. And so it kind of is very consistent with both those YouTube sources. And there we go. That is my favorite sword in my collection, for now at least. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. And I just want to mention, I do plan to have at least another video about this sword, because I want to take it apart. It won't be damaging the sword, because as we already saw, the peen here is missing, so the blade should slide out fairly easily, and everything is held in place by screw, so it should be easy to take apart. And I think it's probably valuable for the community to see a relatively unusual sword taken apart. So it's probably something that couldn't happen every day, especially when they're in very good conditions. I don't think anyone would go and disassemble a very well kept sword of this kind. But also I want to substitute this ugly modern wooden cylinder with a more appropriate, age-appropriate grip. So I want to take it apart to be able to take measurements and kind of see what I need to do. So stay tuned, because I'm going to share the process with you. And yeah, and if other ideas come to mind, I'll be happy to talk more about this sword, because as I mentioned, it's really my favorite. So anyway, for now, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you very soon with another sword video.